Picture this. It's the first decade of the 1900s, and you're walking down the street in your town. In America, probably. You walk past the department store windows where a display for Cluett, Peabody and Company is displayed. The newspaper stand next to you has beautifully illustrated ads on the inside for Arrow Collars, one of the most popular collar and shirt manufacturers of the day. You look up and see a billboard for the same company. All of these ads have one thing in common: the dashingly handsome face of the Arrow Collar Man. He's America's very first true sex symbol, as we think of it today. He's well-dressed, mysterious, and has the build of an athlete. An athlete who's also a prince or something. Maybe you're in love with him. Maybe your husband or wife is too. But unbeknownst to you, and almost everyone else who sees these ads, the main model behind the Arrow Collar Man is taken by the very same artist who paints him, Joseph Christian Leyendecker. Anyone who's followed me or my art practice for long enough has known that it was only a matter of time before I made this video. J.C. Leyendecker and his story holds a very special place in my heart, and he was one of my biggest inspirations when I took up oil painting. In 2018, I embarked on a very intense research bender on his life that resulted in this short biography comic. He Lives in the Echoes. You can buy it on Gumroad, link in the description below. But the research for this wasn't easy. For a historical figure who was as famous and made as much of an impact as Leyendecker did, there's not much in the way of research on him. After he died in the 50s, his legacy was nearly forgotten entirely. This is due to reasons that we'll cover later in this video. So, come along with me, friends, while I tell you about the lives of J.C. Leyendecker and Charles Beach. Christian Leyendecker was born on March 23, 1874, in Montabaur, Germany, to Peter Leyendecker, a farmer and a coachman, and Elizabeth Ordefson Leyendecker. He had other siblings, Mary Augusta and the eldest brother Adolf Albert, and his younger brother, Frank Xavier, was born January 19, 1876. Their mother came from a prominent Jewish and Catholic family, though the children never practiced or openly considered themselves Jewish, and J.C. himself was baptized in Montabaur. In 1972, his mother's youngest brother, Adam Ordefson, immigrated to Chicago and started a sign painting shop. He took night classes at the Chicago Academy of Design, which later moved and became the Art Institute of Chicago. By 1882, his work painting signs for the McAvoy Brewing Company in particular was so good that he had been promoted to general manager and vice president of the whole company. So, of course, he became the American sponsor to bring his sister and her family to the States, and the Leyendeckers made the big journey across the Atlantic that same year. Coming from such a small town in Germany, landing in New York City must have had a special impact on the Leyendecker children. They traveled by train to Chicago and settled in at 2426 South Park Avenue. Peter, their father, became a brewing assistant, and the eldest brother Adolf, apparently old enough to work at the ripe old age of 12, worked for McAvoy as well. But it was already apparent that all four Leyendecker children had a special artistic talent. J.C. recalled, "When I was 8, I was already covering school books with rudely colored examples of my work. At home, I kept myself busy with more pretentious paintings, which, for want of a canvas, were done on oilcloth of the common kitchen variety. At age 15, J.C. too entered the workforce and started a job at the Jacob Manns Engraving Company. I still remember boarding an open cable car one windy day with 3 large canvases wrapped in newspaper and fighting my way through the crowded streets to the engraving house where I showed my samples. The boss inspected a stag at bay, a chariot race, and the biblical subject with amusement, but he did tell me to report for work. In 1889, due to Uncle Adam's good business deals at McAvoy, the family gained a good amount of wealth and were able to live comfortably. J.C. could now afford to attend schooling at the Art Institute of Chicago 3 times a week, where he was taught by John Henry Vanderpool. Augusta and Frank would later become AIC students as well. Adolf and Frank studied with a renowned stained glass artist. Stained glass would later become Adolf's main practice. In 1890, Papa Peter gained U.S. citizenship, which was then simultaneously granted to the whole family. And Big Brother Adolf became the McAvoy general sales agent. So things were really looking up for the family. Until, well, you see, for the longest time, no one knew there was a third Leyendecker brother. Adolf just didn't exist. Why, you ask? Well, in 1893, Adolf got wrapped up in a very public scandal. On September 16th, the National Police Gazette reported this story. Louis Epstein, alderman of the First Ward and the owner of far-famed Randolph Street Dime Museum of Chicago, was engaged to Madame Weber, proprietress and mistress of ceremonies, until her affections were tempted by Adolf Albert Leyendecker, general agent of the McAvoy Brewing Company. He had gold galore, and he had good looks and profusion, and he vowed by the hilarious Bacchus that he would love the blushing Madame until the fires of podunk congealed in chunks. A long, long story, a sweet, sweet story it was that his purloiner of museum men's possessions poured into the ears of the Madame, and after time he'd sworn smooth the road to the stately dame's innermost heart. She toyed coyly with her $50,000 necklace, and blushing like a roadhouse in the morning, she told him she loved him just a little. Adolf Albert, in the exuberance of his and his bartender spirits, wrote a letter to the hotel upon the fashionable banks of Cedar Lake. And in the letter, he ordered a suite of rooms held for himself and his wife. The joy of their meeting can best be learned by reading the last 18 chapters of any of the late society novels, for space here is limited. But if all was very, very fine, until Louis Epstein arrived. He entered the hotel lobby with a peaceful smile upon his visage. "Are Mr. and Mrs. Leyendecker here?" he asked sweetly. "Oh yes," replied the clerk, who was less versed in wisdom than most hotel clerks. "How nice," murmured Louis with his smile becoming beatific. "May I see my dear friends?" "Oh yes," obligingly replied the clerk. "You may go right up." "How kind of you," murmured Louis, and as the smile gave place to an ominous frown, he dashed up those steps like an alpine gazelle. He opened the door to the boudoir and saw what he saw. There was Adolf Albert sitting down in a nice easy chair in the most domestic way imaginable. His feet were encased in slippers, and his soul ensconced in joy. They were having such a nice domestic time until the door opened. "Louis!" gasped the Madame as she caught his reflection in the mirror. "Epstein!" screeched Adolf, as he forgot domesticity, forgot the peril of his sweetheart, forgot the promises he'd made to defend her, forgot how he loved her, forgot how she loved him, and forgot all else in his wild, wild flight for liberty. He made a frantic dash, and dodged beneath Louis's arm, and half-rolled, half-sprawled down the stairway, and out upon the pier, where he jumped wildly into the nearest rowboat and offered the boatman fabulous sums to row him across the lake. 100 folks that grew into 1,000 saw the man being ferried away, coatless, hatless, shoeless. A very national embarrassment, and one that specified Adolf's full name and place of employment, which, in a time where public reputation is literally everything, and one incident like this could ruin you, it was a big fucking deal for the whole family. While Adolf lost his job and public standing, JC was a rising star in the art world. At 19, he was already illustrating numerous books and magazines. He asked his family to allow him to study abroad at the famed Académie Julian in Paris, where he could learn the fine skills of the old masters. Frank asked to go as well, and their parents were like, "Okay, sick, brotherly bonding trip." JC himself was a soft-spoken, very polite sort of guy. Almost every photo of him is very dark and brooding looking. I've only ever seen one photo of him smiling in the Leyendecker family album that is in the Hagen Museum archives. On the other hand, Frank was more happy-go-lucky, less serious, but he was the one that people said always struggled with depression. The parents probably hoped this trip would help both of them emotionally. I mean, it didn't, but damn, they sure did learn a lot. In Paris, they rubbed shoulders with a wide number of legendary artists, friends of John Singer Sargent, if not Sargent himself, Alphonse Mucha, Filippo Colarossi, Benjamin Constant, and more. In 1897, JC opened a solo show at the Salon du Champ de Mars, and Alphonse Mucha was super into it and told all of his pals to go. JC wrote home to Uncle Adam saying, "I had few preconceived notions of what the life in the school in Quartier Latin would be like. I wished to find surprises, and I did. One of the first things which came to me, and which I had not counted upon, was a strangely lost feeling. Lost among a whole crowd of fellows who had done something worthwhile. It was like beginning all over again, with no friendly credit remarks to your score of the past. But I soon found that the men were good fellows, hard workers, and as appreciative as they were critical. On JC's first day of class, he was told the tradition was that new students must buy snacks for their peers, and he was excited to join in with this very bohemian tradition. Every student got in a line, hands on shoulders, and basically conga line out of the school down the street to the nearest cafe, where JC bought everyone drinks. JC fell in love with these cafes, where he would sit for hours studying people, their expressions and habits, the colors and light, and sketch and paint or draw. Of Paris's romantic lifestyle, he said, "No lesson to be learned there is, it seems to me, of greater value and importance to the young American artist than the necessity of taking the time to dream over the work in hand. The American tendency is to rush at everything. Over here, one learns to let artistic plans ripen and mature easily with much deliberation. This brings the freedom which comes only with a sense of leisure, a feeling which is very necessary to good art." In summer of 1897, the two brothers returned home to Chicago. They first opened a shared studio in the Chicago Stock Exchange building, where they became overwhelmed with commissions. Frank, whose artistic style was fairly similar to JC's, would take on any jobs that JC didn't have time for. In 1898, the Chicago Fine Arts Building at 410 South Michigan Avenue was opened, and the brothers took the penthouse space for their studio. The next year, the building commissioned Frank to paint a mural on the 10th floor. You can still go visit it today. Just walk right in and take the antique elevator up, though it might be closed due to COVID. Chicago friends, please go say hi to Frank's mural for me. He needs some love, and I miss him. Meanwhile, Big Bro Adolf got married and moved out, and Mama Leyendecker began a very dedicated campaign to find a husband for Augusta, who was now 28 and very much refusing to marry. Without Adolf, family of now 5 made a big move to New York City in 1902, where they would remain for the rest of their lives. Mama Leyendecker continued her campaign to find Augusta a man, and Frank and JC, also unmarried but clearly under no pressure to be, opened a new studio at 7 East 32nd Street. They took on jobs for the Saturday Evening Post, Ivory Soap, Collier's, The Delineator, and many, many more. The brothers were as busy as ever, and it was here at this studio that Charles Beach arrived. Charles Allwood Beach was born November 17, 1881, in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, to a British family. His parents were George Beach, a broker from England, and Emily, or Emma, Ida Desiali, however the fuck you pronounce that, and he had 5 older siblings, Caroline, William, Ellen, Thomas, and Henry. Though it's super weird with Henry because he's listed as being named Charles in multiple places, they might have changed his name for some reason, who knows. So this is where things in Charles's timeline get a little crazy. I had to go almost entirely based on census data, and any historian will agree with me, census data is not the easiest way of parsing out solid information. When Charles was 20 in 1901, he was working in a cigar factory in London, Ontario. According to Charles himself, somewhere along the line he moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and worked as a model for art students. He spoke to journalist Ed Wallace for the New York World Telegram and Sun in 1951 after JC died. He said that at 16, he responded to an ad in the paper calling for figure models at an art school. And when he got there, the teacher assumed he had experience, so she simply handed him a towel and told him to take off his clothes. Charles recalled, "I didn't know what to make of it. I was very slow taking off my clothes, and the teacher asked what was delaying me. I asked for more information on the job, and it was explained to me. I realized then that it was honorable work. In those days, they changed models each week, but they liked me so well they gave me work for 5 weeks. I could hold a pose for hour after hour. They paid me $7 a week. In today's money, that's approximately $221, so not too shabby." Now, he says he was 16 when he did that first modeling gig, but it also says that immediately after that gig, he was told to go to New York, which was in 1903. None of that timeline makes any sense, so there's 3 potential options here. The first 2 make the least sense, so I won't waste time going over them, but option 3 is Charles didn't begin modeling at 16, but rather at 22 in 1903, when he could have taken that job and gone to New York the same year. We know for certain that 1903 was the year that move happened, so that's my guess, but we'll never know for sure. Anyway, onwards. After that modeling gig ended, Charles befriended a group of chorus girls who begged him to come to New York City with them. He was unsure about it, but later met an artist who told him that New York models were living well and literally rolling in wealth. Now, that sounded pretty great. Certainly better than a cigar factory. Speculation incoming. I have to assume that Charles didn't have a fantastic relationship with his family, because for the rest of his life it seems like he only really kept in contact with one of his siblings, Caroline, who married into the Kellogg family. Her husband, Andrew Kellogg, is listed as Charles' closest contact on his World War I registration card. He's also not buried near any of his family. We'll never know what happened there or why. Maybe he was just a loner. Maybe there was a fight. Maybe they found out he was gay. Some things are forever lost to history. But we do know this. Charles had some very bad separation anxiety. This will become apparent later. Okay, speculation over. So with 85 cents in his pocket, Charles Beach took a train to the city that never sleeps. At first he auditioned for a number of plays, and unfortunately, he had no acting skills whatsoever. However, he was so desperately handsome that the directors brought him on basically just to be on-stage eye candy. Disappointed and not adjusting easily, he reconnected with the chorus girls, and fate opened one eye for him. One of the girls told him that her brother was a model for Frank Leyendecker. Maybe he could go to the studio and ask for a job. Yeah, why not? Charles went down to the Leyendecker studio, and Frank answered the door, immediately blown away by Charles's good looks. Needless to say, he was hired. Frank wrote an enthusiastic letter to JC, who was out of office at the time, saying, "At last, I have found a model who never wants to rest and refuses to talk while he poses." This must have been an issue. Charles was truly the whole package. Norman Rockwell later described him in his autobiography as tall, powerfully built, and extraordinarily handsome. Looked like an athlete from one of the Ivy League colleges. He spoke with a clipped British accent and was always beautifully dressed. His manners were polished and impeccable. And when JC finally returned to meet Charles, well, obviously he fell in love. Somewhere along the line, Charles ended up modeling exclusively for JC as the relationship deepened. This probably became a bit of a sore spot for Frank because, here's this perfect hunk who drops into their studio out of nowhere, Frank hires him, and yet again, his brother outshines him somehow. It must have hurt. Frank was always desperately trying to claw his way out of JC's shadow, and now his brother even has a perfect relationship along with his perfect career. Frank didn't have the same work ethic, focus, or ambition that JC had, and it was incredibly hard for him to fix that, as well as make a name for himself without being compared to his brother. Charles appeared in so many of JC's ads for Arrow collars that he became known as the Arrow Collar Man. It's authentic, look. There were, of course, multiple models, some going on to become Hollywood stars like Neil Hamilton, Jack Mulhall, Brian Donlevy, but Charles is noticeably the main star. The Arrow Collar Man rocketed his face and JC's work to fame, and his good looks were so powerful, the Arrow shirt factory in Troy, New York was getting flooded with thousands of love letters from girls across the country pining for him. He even got more letters than Rudolph Valentino. This later inspired the 1920s comedy musical Helen of Troy, New York, in which the model of the Inn musical Yarrow Shirt Company is a mincing queen. A little off the nose there, don't you think? Charles remembered, what the boss did was to make everybody look like they hoped they looked. Sometimes JC would tweak Charles's appearance for one reason or another, giving him blonde hair, a little mustache, a crazy buff body, a different nose. Charles became America's first true sex symbol, a figure of style and class that people yearned to be, and so many of the paintings of him make him look so happy, like he's having the time of his life. Given Charles's poor acting skills, I personally like to imagine that that's the effect of posing for someone he loved, who made him happy. And I imagine JC was probably very happy being able to paint a person he loved who really understood him and his struggles. By 1904, the Leyendecker parents finally accepted that all three of their not disowned children were probably, not gonna marry for reasons, and they moved out, leaving Augusta to carve out her own life taking care of her two brothers and essentially taking on the job of family organizer and manager. Mama Leyendecker died abruptly in 1905, and Augusta became the matriarch. Frank and JC opened a new studio at the Beaux Art Building in 1909, and Charles moved into one of the studio's rooms as an efficiency apartment. He began taking on studio assistant duties along with his modeling. He would pose, take appointments, clean, organize things, get materials, and at night, JC would frequently stay with him. They explored New York's nightlife together, attending the theater, likely meeting Charles's theater friends, frequenting restaurants, and having a good time. Meanwhile, Big Bro Adolf got caught up in yet another public scandal involving a forged check and him trying to get away with it by convincing people he's related to the famous J.C. Leyendecker. This incident further cemented his ostracization from his siblings, and he moved his family from Chicago to Kansas City, Missouri to start over. Awkward. Eventually, the Leyendecker family decided to build a home in New Rochelle up in Westchester. They named the street Mount Tom Road in honor of Montabaur, their hometown. Frank's new studio would be there, finally a sharp divorce from working with his brother. In 2018, I had the wonderful opportunity to have a personal guided tour of the mansion, which is now the Mount Tom Day School. The part of the mansion pictured here is the original property. JC didn't actually live there himself for some time. He practically lived with Charles and preferred to work out of the Bryant Park studio. Plus, they wanted Frank to have some space to try and get his own career off the ground more. Charles is listed as a sort of overseer of the construction of the house, but it was officially owned by Frank. The big studio in there was Frank's too. Then JC, Augusta, and their father moved in, and they had a completely separate wing added in the more traditional German style. This is where JC's studio was, and likely Charles's room. Although his room may have also been in this small wing on the third floor where the workers' stairway was, we'll never know for sure. This is also likely where Theodore Alston stayed, a live-in worker listed on the 1940 census. We don't know anything further about him or what his duties were, but obviously these people had a lot of money. They had a house staff. There are a lot of interesting secret passageways in the house due to the nature of the separate wings. Here's the parlor, which was used mostly for all the entertaining they did later on. The door on the far left leading to a passageway is a secret door that blends into the wall. There are some aspects of the home that appear to have been changed during renovations at some point. For instance, the fireplace here is different now from how it looked in 1919 in this issue of the Country Life magazine, where Frank showed the home. Frank is pictured here in the parlor, playing with one of the two collies that they owned. On the wall you can see a painting of JC and Frank, which unfortunately has since gone missing. A quick note on this 1919 photo in particular before moving on. This photo is very frequently attributed to showing Charles, but it's not. It is, in fact, Frank, as you can see in this photo showing Frank with the dogs, wearing the exact same outfit. JC is holding a camera, so I imagine it's possible he was the one taking the photos that day. The main studio is the focal point of the entire house. Here's a look at it from Country Life. The balcony above is coming from a small room where the models would get costumed. Then they would step onto the balcony so JC or Frank could see if they look good for the piece. As for the backyard, the back of the home has changed quite a bit from how it looked in its heyday. Today it's covered mostly in children's play equipment and facilities. I didn't take that many photos of it for that reason. It's nice that the children have so much to play with and on, but it's also kind of a shame that JC's beautiful fabled garden is gone. It was apparently the delight of horticulturalists the world over, and it was JC's greatest treasure. I think he would have been very happy to know that his home is a school, but also very sad to know that the garden is no more. Behind that red fence is where a waterfall used to be, pictured here with JC. As you can see, he always had a habit of not smiling in photos. I'm unsure if it was because he just didn't smile much or if it's due to his hatred of photography. Following that fence to the right, unpictured, is a stone gazebo where guests may have gone to get a quiet moment away from the parties. Further down the grounds, there used to be housing for all sorts of animals, particularly birds, which JC loved very much, as mentioned in this article from the Saturday Evening Post. When Papa Leyendecker passed away from a stroke in 1916, Charles finally moved in. This was an extremely contentious move for the family, and Augusta in particular was not happy about it. After all, her whole job was keeping her family together, and she saw Charles as a huge risk to their well-being and reputation. Frank was also upset, feeling that he was being replaced. But now, Charles was officially JC's secretary and was an integral part of the art practice. In an effort to better network and market JC's work, Charles had them use the huge mansion to host massive parties. These parties slowly became almost legendary, growing in size and status until every big name in every glamorous industry was attending. And if you didn't attend, you definitely weren't cool. JC wasn't a party animal, but being the official host was enough, and Charles was extremely good at passing off business networking as friendly party conversation. Of course, most people knew that the hosts were gay, but you didn't dare tell anyone or else you wouldn't be invited back. There's a lot of speculation that these legendary parties were some of the inspiration for F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Well, we'll never have proof or know for sure, but it sure does line up, doesn't it? Certainly helps that some people say Fitzgerald himself had a crush on Leyendecker, but let's be real, Fitzgerald had the hots for literally everybody. The man was a mess. Anyway, all the little nods to Leyendecker and The Great Gatsby make me happy nonetheless. But just like Gatsby, underneath all the glitz and roaring 20s glamour, there's a whole lot of pain that never leaves the castle walls. Augusta acted as Frank's agent of sorts throughout his life until after he died. She put a lot of work into ensuring that he got work into the world, even though he often didn't finish it, and multiple times JC even had to finish pieces for him. She was his model for a lot of his paintings, and when Frank couldn't finish his pieces, he couldn't make any money, and so he often came up short on his end of the rent. Charles stepped in these instances, paying Frank's rent for him. Additionally, Charles transformed JC's business practices as his secretary, not shying away from more forward methods of networking and negotiating. He managed to drive up JC's income by the thousands. It may have helped that he spoke on and off with the British accent that he learned from his father. Augusta and Frank both found his methods to be extremely uncouth, and it was the subject of many of their fights. But they couldn't argue with the fact that the methods worked, and at some point, Charles began receiving a percentage of the income from each of JC's pieces rather than the total income. Rockwell spoke on this in his autobiography, saying that he believed this was Charles's attempt to own part of JC in the house and push Frank out. I feel it should be noted that Rockwell had a very strong view of Charles that painted him as a sort of villain, literally describing him as, quote, a real parasite, like some huge white cold insect clinging to Joe's back. And stupid. I don't think I ever heard him say anything even remotely intelligent. Not that he talked much. Things that anyone would have found normal in a heterosexual couple, Rockwell painted as somehow villainous with JC and Charles. And not only that, and I'm going to take a bit of an aside here, it's pretty clear that Rockwell might have been coming at this from a very privileged angle as a straight man. When he looked at JC and Charles, all he saw was a terrified man being shut in and preyed on by another man. But he never once considered how terrifying it was to be gay in America at the time, how much JC could lose if anyone ever found out. His entire career would be gone, and art was always the most important thing to him. To continue being one of the most prominent illustrators of the era and still live with his male lover and model, what sacrifices did he have to make? Well, they had to be extremely secretive and constantly on guard. It's not an easy tightrope to walk. That constant fear of being found out and ruined just for loving someone is something that Rockwell could never understand. On that exact note, there's no question that Charles had some issues. Augusta had long been telling JC to get married in order to better hide his sexuality. Eventually, afraid for his career and the reputation of his friends, JC asked one of his models to marry him in a lavender marriage, which is a heterosexual marriage intended to cover up homosexuality. Many people in lavender marriages remained with their gay lovers, and JC probably wanted the same for him and Charles. This is just my speculation, though. But Charles was not having it. He threatened to out JC as gay if he went through with the marriage. In the end, the marriage never happened, but JC and Charles both remained close friends with that model for the rest of their lives. In another related story, JC and a model took a trip to Canada with no notice. Charles, in the dark and afraid, arrived at Norman Rockwell's house and begged him for any information on JC's whereabouts, or information on the model. Rockwell told him what he knew, reluctantly. Charles promptly had a panic attack, ranting frustratedly and crying, and I mean a literal panic attack, coupled with some kind of meltdown. He had clearly been bottling up some emotions for a while. The whole incident just irritated Rockwell, though. Speculation alert. I have a suspicion that these two stories I just mentioned are connected, probably the same story, and likely involve the same model. At least, it would make a lot of sense. Okay, speculation over. More than anything, Augusta was there to support her brothers, and to do that, she believed it was dangerous for JC to be living with his lover. An acquaintance once described her as domineering, hot-tempered, and fiercely devoted to her family. She desperately wanted to save her brothers from ruin, and she hated Charles, but it was mostly because she was loyal to her family. JC didn't appreciate her efforts to save him, and Frank was tangibly slipping further and further into his substance abuse, leading him to act out in weird ways. Like the time in 1922 after he painted The Flapper, easily his most famous work, and he was asked to go to Atlantic City to judge a beauty contest for some reason. He made comments to reporters saying, quote, The modern girl has no heart, no soul, no sentiment. If she has, she refuses to admit it. You do not dare to talk to the flapper of classics nor of other serious things, for she simply will make no attempt to absorb them. She is idle, frivolous, and heedless of tomorrow. She assumes no responsibility, she seeks nothing but amusement. When a boy reaches the flapper age, he usually has some obligation to fulfill. He gets a job, or else he is branded a loafer. The girl, however, spends her time reading frothy literature and smoking. Okay. He also continuously failed to make his deadlines and spent much more than he earned. The differences between him and his brother grew starker and more bitter. He attempted to move out, but missed his rent and was evicted, and was forced to return to Mount Tom Road, where things only got worse. Frank's last magazine cover was a cover of a modern witch riding a vacuum cleaner as a broom for Halloween. Augusta was the model. When they showed the painting to JC, he seemed neutral about it and asked Augusta to model for him as well. Almost in an act of revenge, JC changed the final painting, transforming her into a grotesque caricature of a witch, and her only companion, a screeching bat. The two siblings finally had enough one night in August 1923 when a fight broke out between Charles and Augusta. She slapped him, spat in his face, and left the home. Frank followed her. She recounted this to Norman Rockwell later, but wouldn't say exactly what the fight was about. But it had only been a matter of time. Augusta went to Manhattan, and Frank moved into an apartment above a garage near Norman Rockwell's studio. But Frank continued to be unable to work due to the strain of his situation, and he continued to drink. Augusta and Frank leaving the home was really the catalyst of what became a defining element of JC and Charles from that day forth. They no longer had the partial security of having family around to make it less suspicious for them to be living together. Now, to be a famous artist living alone with another man, it could draw all sorts of the wrong types of attention. It may have seemed like a good idea for Frank and Augusta at the time, but it really was the beginning of their downfall too. Augusta was now considered only a spinster since she would refuse to marry, and Frank now had no one living with him to keep his addictions in check, and to make sure that he got work done. The bad tensions between the siblings continued even after they parted ways. Frank had struggled with his drug and alcohol addiction since he picked them up during his and JC's stay in Paris, and his end was a combination of many factors: inadequate mental health care, his inability to separate his career from his brother's, and the greater homophobic landscape. There's a couple of accounts of people implying that Frank was someone who had hookups but had a hard time finding a long-term partner. To be honest, JC and Charles are a rare case of sheer luck. Frank likely felt jealous both of their relationship and of the fact that Charles fell for his brother when Frank was the one who hired him. Jealousy, then resentment, all marinated in a long-time feeling of inadequacy. Frank made a few efforts to cut the cord between him and JC so that he might make his own name for himself, rather than always being compared to him, but all of these efforts fell through for one reason or another. By the time he finally did leave, he was far too sick to properly take care of himself. Norman Rockwell accompanied him to a few psychiatrist appointments and allowed him to sit in his studio while he worked. I'll give Rockwell a lot of credit here. He was a huge support for Frank in his final days. One day in the studio, Frank asked, "Gee, don't the dark corners bother you?" Norman was confused. "What dark corners? Don't the corners get all black, as if there was a pit behind them?" How do you respond to that? He later brought Norman a small bottle of the secret oil solution that he and JC had used in their work. It was a huge thank you for Norman's help in keeping him somewhat tethered after the falling out. Norman never used it, as he found it too slick to paint with. But that moment, when he looked up at Frank as he explained the ratios of various oils, that's when Norman realized that Frank was dying. His face and body were gaunt underneath his dapper clothes, and he looked so many years older than he actually was. He died on Good Friday, 1924. The death was either an accidental overdose or a suicide, but it really could be either one. The drugs had ravaged him so badly, the coroners listed his age in the 60s rather than his actual age of 48. The funeral was private, and in the morning, someone came to Frank's tiny studio, disassembled his beautiful Baroque bed frame, and took it back to the mansion. After Frank's death, JC never fully recovered from his regret. With his aunt and uncle's help, he made an effort to reconnect with Augusta, and financially supported her for the rest of his life. But there's this myth that after Frank died, JC became a complete hermit and never left the mansion. This is very untrue. He taught painting classes, went out in the evenings, took drives. He even had the family of late close friend and artist Coles Phillips stay with him after Phillips' death, during which time he took the children into the city to see movies. J.C. Leyendecker always loved children, something which is a prominent theme in his work, and also the reason why I think he would be happy to know that his home is now a school. Many of his child models were the local New Rochelle kids, and a few of them reflected on him as a very kind, fatherly figure. Charles was also a fatherly figure, but definitely more of a drill sergeant type. Fucking Scorpios. They also remember the two as being a nice couple. He was an intensely private man, however. He famously refused to give interviews, save for the couple of statements he gave to the Saturday Evening Post and to the New York Times after Coles Phillips died. And Charles only ever had one interview, which I mentioned earlier. This private nature was a part of them both inherently, and mostly because the world around them was unkind to gay people. JC knew that if word got out that he was gay, it would be the end of his career and a stain on the reputation of his friends. After all, his brand hinged on his illustrations for major holidays and fashion advertisements, which then defined the culture, starting with Every American Family. Can't have a gay man defining American culture, can you? The big secret is, they always have. During the Great Depression, JC lost much of his usual ad contracts. After it was over, Greater America had little interest in Leyendecker's Gilded Age brand of work. It was more popular to look at less luxurious, raw views of the average American. Thus, Norman Rockwell essentially replaced JC, to the point where the public became confused as to who truly came first, and then later forgot JC ever existed at all. Rockwell, a longtime devoted friend and fan of Leyendecker, obviously never intended for this to be the case. All his life, JC refused to work using photo references. He always used a model, to the point where he openly hated the use of photo reference. Part of this was due to how complicated even taking one photo was at the time, and due to his strong European Old Masters education. But it was also because JC believed that when photography rose to prominence in commercial art, traditional commercial illustrators like himself would become irrelevant. And in a way, he was right. How often now do you see magazines and newspapers with ads that are illustrated rather than a photo? The day the Saturday Evening Post published a cover with a photo instead of a painting, Charles, thoroughly stunned, told JC, "Joe, you're finished. They don't want you anymore." And he was right. Shortly after, the Post fired JC. His final cover with them was Baby New Year 1943, slicing a swastika in half. He'd had a very difficult time getting work after that. In the last few years of his life, he mentioned a few times that he believed he'd been forgotten. Maybe if I could do it all over again, I'd do it differently. I don't know. Maybe I couldn't have. He had made the choice to keep himself a very private man, and that gave him the ability to live with Charles. And despite Charles's pre-war uncanny ability to negotiate and bring JC in great amounts of business and money, the more long-term consequence was the disappearance of JC's greater legacy. It wasn't until the 70s that anyone even bothered writing a book about him, and that book is J.C. Leyendecker by Michael Shau. So they kept themselves behind the mansion walls for the most part. JC became more wrapped up in maintaining his beautiful garden. Charles remembered in 1951, he planned everything with an eye for form and color. Every plant and flower was placed just where he wanted it. In the spring it was a glorious sight. I mow this myself now. It keeps me slender. When JC got too old and his health began to fail, Charles took up many of the gardening duties and cooked for him. One day, as he was relaxing in his garden, JC suffered a heart attack. Charles ran to call the doctor, made JC another drink. It was a Chapman's, by the way. Charles was very specific about this for some reason. And waited by his side. JC passed away before the doctor arrived at the age of 77. And just like Frank, his funeral was attended only by a very select few. Now, his body of work was an issue. Before his death, he'd said, "Charles, I want them all destroyed. I don't want to have them floating around," referring to all his unfinished sketches and miscellaneous drawings. We'll never know if he wanted them burned because they were incriminating or for some other reason, but regardless, Charles followed through on his wishes and burned most of them. Into the fire they went. Sketches, some paintings, photos, letters. This is a common theme that I see in nearly every queer historical figure that I've researched. One of them dies, and their memory is taken away in flames. As for Augusta, she lived on her own until her death in 1957 as well. She held on to many of JC's paintings, especially the Kellogg's kids, before finally donating her collection, as well as her family artifacts, to the Hagen Museum in Stockton, California. Charles never recovered from JC's death. Now all that is past. The boss is gone, and I'm like a ship without a rudder. The house and grounds like a great ship with the bottom dropped out. He became an alcoholic, which spurred the idea that he sold the paintings for alcohol money, because he sold most of the paintings in a yard sale after JC's death, as determined by JC's will. As if he cared for JC that little. It wasn't like that at all. Charles sold the unburned paintings because it was what was directed to him in JC's will. JC was a hard believer that his work should be shared with the world rather than locked up somewhere, so selling it to the public was the only option that he wanted. It just so happens that, in his despair, Charles used that money on booze. He hadn't been alone in 50 years. Unable to keep up the estate anymore, Charles sold it and moved into a small room on nearby Pintard Avenue, with a number of JC's paintings rolled up in tubes. He died of a heart attack in 1954 on the way to the hospital. His body was cremated and interned at Ferncliff Cemetery and Mausoleum, paid for by whom I have literally no clue. I looked everywhere. Meanwhile, JC and Frank are buried with their parents and Augusta on the family plot in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Big brother Adolf is noticeably absent. During that one final interview, Charles said, "There isn't much I can say about my life, only this. JC was a great man and very good to me. As for myself, I worked hard as hell and always was on the level. I came with the boss in 1903 and stuck through to the end. So it's all up to me now. I was with the boss for 49 years, first his model, then his secretary, and always his friend." Thank you for listening to the story of JC Leyendecker and Charles Beach. It's a wild ride and one that I hope gets more attention. JC and Frank both deserve it. As I researched this in 2018, I was still attending SAIC. When I emailed a few people at the school and museum about giving the two more alumnus recognition, I only got shrugs in return. It's extremely disappointing. But maybe someday, these amazing artists will get their flowers. JC was terrified of the idea that he would be forgotten, so if you and I can remember him, and other people like him, well, that's the best part of learning history, right? The dead are never truly dead, so long as we still remember them. If you enjoyed this gay biography journey, let me know by commenting and subscribing. I'm hoping to do more in the future. All my sources are coming up as usual, but unfortunately, many sources on Leyendecker have a lot of incorrect info, as I discovered. Particularly this book by Lawrence and Judy Cutler. It's still a good book, but they definitely needed to do a little bit more fact-checking before publication. Also, the tone they use when describing people in the book is kind of weird. My personal two biggest recommendations are Michael Shau's JC Leyendecker, and especially David Saunders' very, very well-researched biography of Leyendecker in Illustration Magazine 50. Until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and go drink some water, you dehydrated clowns.